If you can't afford rent, maybe you shouldn't have kids. The words landed like a slap in a quiet courtroom. Not shouted. Not whispered. Said casually, the way someone speaks when they're used to power and never questioned for it. Across from him stood a single mother, shoulders tight, hands shaking just enough to notice. 2 children. 1 late rent payment. And when she came home from work, there was no warning taped to the door. No court notice. No phone call. Just changed locks and her children standing there asking why they couldn't go inside their own home. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't paperwork gone wrong. This was someone deciding that money mattered more than a family. What happened next is the reason this courtroom moment spread across the country, because when Judge Frank Caprio heard how this eviction was carried out, the room shifted. The confidence on one side of the courtroom didn't disappear yet, but it cracked. And before this case was over, the law was about to remind everyone why it exists in the first place. If you believe families deserve protection when power is abused, stay with this story, because by the end, you may find yourself wanting to show exactly where you stand. She stood quietly at the plaintiff's table, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned, over years of scraping by, that speaking too loudly rarely helped people like her. She was American, born and raised, the kind of person who did everything society told her to do and still ended up here. Full-time job, night shifts whenever she could get them, weekends that blurred into weekdays. Her life ran on alarms, packed lunches, and careful calculations about what bill could wait a few days and which one couldn't. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking to be heard. She was a mother of 2 school-age children. Old enough to understand fear, young enough to still believe adults always had answers. Every morning she woke them before sunrise, made breakfast from whatever was left in the fridge, and walked them to the bus stop before heading to work. At night, she came home exhausted, feet aching, eyes burning, but she still checked homework, washed uniforms, and tried to make the small apartment feel safe. That apartment wasn't luxury. It wasn't even comfortable. But it was home. And to her kids, that mattered more than anything. The rent hadn't been late because of irresponsibility. It hadn't been missed because of neglect. It was late because life had collided with her all at once. A medical emergency, unexpected, unavoidable, and expensive. One moment she was managing, barely staying afloat, and the next she was choosing between a doctor's bill and the rent, believing she had a few days to catch up. She had planned to pay. She had the money coming. She just needed time. Not forgiveness. Not charity. Just time. "I never got a notice," she said quietly when the judge asked her to explain. Her voice didn't crack, but it wavered the way it does when someone is holding themselves together with effort. "I would have paid. I just needed time." She didn't say it like a defense. She said it like a fact. Like something she had repeated to herself 100 times since that day, wondering where everything went wrong. She explained how she checked the door every night after work. No letter taped to it. No warning slipped under. No certified mail waiting at the post office. She checked her phone constantly, expecting a call, an email, something. Nothing came. And then one evening, after a double shift, she brought her kids home and knew something was wrong before she even reached the door. The key didn't turn. The handle felt unfamiliar. Cold. Final. The locks had been changed. She described the moment slowly, not because she wanted drama, but because it still hadn't fully settled in her mind. Her children asking why the door wouldn't open. Her standing there, exhausted and confused, trying to stay calm so they wouldn't panic. The neighbor peeking through their blinds. The quiet humiliation of realizing that everything they owned was now inaccessible. Clothes, school supplies, family photos, medication. All of it locked away without a word. She held a folder as she spoke, thick with papers that had become her shield. Pay stubs. Medical bills. Text messages that were never answered. Notices she never received. Her hands tightened around the edges of it, knuckles pale, as if letting go would cause everything to spill out at once. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her eyes glistened in that way people recognize instantly. The way someone looks when they are desperately trying not to break in public. She talked about calling friends, embarrassed but desperate. About trying to explain to her children why they couldn't sleep in their own beds. About sitting in her car that night, engine off, lights out, wondering how quickly a life could unravel. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't accuse. She simply told the truth as it had happened, one detail at a time, because the truth was already heavy enough. What made her story harder to ignore was how ordinary it was. There was no dramatic backstory. No reckless behavior. No excuses wrapped in attitude. Just a working mother who had done the math one too many times and come up short once. And for that, her home had been taken away without warning. Without process. Without dignity. As she spoke, she kept glancing down, not wanting to meet the landlord's eyes. Not out of guilt, but out of fatigue. She looked like someone who had been explaining herself for far too long. To employers, to schools, to doctors, to bills that didn't care why they were late. This courtroom was just another place where she had to justify her existence, her choices, her worth as a parent. She finished where she began, with the simplest truth of all. I wasn't trying to avoid paying, she said. I just needed time. And I didn't even know I'd lost my home until it was already gone. The room stayed quiet after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone understood exactly what was at stake now. This wasn't about rent anymore. It was about whether the law would recognize her humanity, or whether power would be allowed to erase it. The contrast became clear the moment the landlord stood up. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look unsure. He walked to his place with the ease of someone who had done this before and never expected consequences. Well-dressed, relaxed posture, chin slightly raised. This wasn't his only property, and everyone in the room could tell. He owned several units across the city. He made sure to say that early, as if it somehow proved competence rather than control. To him, this wasn't a family's crisis. It was a transaction that hadn't gone his way. This is business, he said flatly, leaning back once he finished introducing himself. Not a hint of apology. Not a trace of hesitation. Just certainty. He spoke as if the case were already decided, as if the court were merely a formality standing between him and being proven right. When asked about the eviction, he didn't soften his tone. He hardened it. She's irresponsible, he said, shaking his head. I gave her chances. Tenants always have excuses. The words landed heavily, especially after what the courtroom had just heard. There was no acknowledgement of the medical emergency. No recognition of the children. No curiosity about whether his version of events matched reality. He spoke in generalities, lumping this mother into a category he clearly despised. I've been doing this a long time, he continued. I know how these situations go. You give an inch, they take a mile. At one point, as the judge began to ask a question, the landlord interrupted. Not aggressively, but casually, which somehow made it worse. He talked over the bench as if he were correcting a customer, not addressing a court. The interruption earned him a sharp look, but he barely seemed to notice. He was too focused on making his point, too confident that the law was on his side simply because he believed it should be. When the subject of the children came up, his reaction said more than his words ever could. He shrugged. A small, dismissive movement of the shoulders, as if their existence was an inconvenience rather than a responsibility he had helped assume by renting to a family. That's not my problem, he said. I rent apartments. I don't run a daycare. There was no malice in his voice, only indifference. And that indifference filled the room. He framed himself as the victim next. Claimed he had been taken advantage of. Claimed he was tired of people playing the system. He talked about losses, about fairness, about how landlords like him were always portrayed as villains. Yet not once did he mention the locks. Not once did he explain why there was no warning. He danced around specifics, leaning instead on the confidence of someone used to being believed without having to prove much at all. Every time the judge tried to slow him down, to bring the conversation back to facts, the landlord pushed forward with conclusions. I did everything legally, he insisted, repeating it like a shield. He said it often enough that it began to sound less like truth and more like something he needed to convince himself of. He pointed to policies, to experience, to how things were normally done. But normal in his world didn't include accountability. What made his demeanor especially jarring was how detached it was from the consequences. This wasn't a spreadsheet error. This wasn't a delayed payment logged incorrectly. This was a family locked out of their home. And yet he spoke as if the situation were abstract, as if the children were hypothetical and the harm theoretical. He never once looked at the mother while she stood there listening to him describe her as a problem to be removed. As he talked, the tension in the room tightened. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he didn't believe he had done anything wrong, not because the law supported him, but because he believed his position placed him above scrutiny. He had money. He had properties. He had done this before. In his mind, that was enough. The judge listened without interrupting, allowing the landlord to reveal himself fully. Every dismissive phrase, every interruption, every careless shrug added another layer to the picture forming in front of the courtroom. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't confusion about procedure. This was a man who believed rules were flexible when they inconvenienced him, and rigid when they protected him. By the time he finished speaking, there was a strange quiet. Not the kind that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that follows clarity. The audience didn't need to be told what was wrong. They could feel it. And somewhere beneath the landlord's confidence, beneath the practiced explanations and legal buzzwords, a different truth was starting to surface. One he hadn't prepared for. One that was about to turn his certainty into something far more fragile. The courtroom shifted as the conversation moved away from opinions and into evidence. Judge Frank Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply leaned forward and asked the kind of questions that don't sound dangerous until you realize they leave no room to hide. "Let's talk about proof," he said calmly. "Do you have a written notice showing when you informed the tenant she was being evicted?" The landlord didn't hesitate. He reached into his folder with the confidence of someone who believed preparation alone was enough. He handed over a single sheet of paper, sliding it across as if it settled everything. "That's the notice," he said. "It clearly states the eviction." His tone carried a quiet satisfaction, the kind that assumes the judge will glance at it, nod, and move on. The judge didn't move on. He picked up the paper slowly and read it in silence. No commentary. No reaction. Just eyes scanning line by line. The room waited. After a moment he looked up. "This document doesn't have a tenant's signature," he said. It wasn't a question. The landlord shrugged. "She didn't sign it," he replied. "That doesn't mean she didn't get it." The judge nodded slightly, then continued. "There's no certified delivery receipt here either. No proof it was mailed. No timestamp showing when it was posted. How did you deliver this notice?" The landlord shifted his weight. "I posted it on the door," he said. "That's standard practice." The judge glanced down again. "According to this," he said, tapping the page, "the date listed is 3 days after the locks were changed." He paused just long enough for the meaning to sink in. "Can you explain that?" The landlord opened his mouth, then closed it. "It might be a clerical error," he said finally. "Dates get mixed up. Clerical errors don't lock families out of their homes," the judge replied evenly. The landlord's confidence began to thin just slightly. He tried to recover by leaning on familiarity. "I've been doing this for years," he said. "This is how notices are handled. Tenants say they don't get them all the time." The judge looked up again. "This court doesn't operate on assumptions," he said. "It operates on evidence." He turned to the mother. "Did you ever see this notice?" She shook her head. "No, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I check the door every day." The judge nodded once, then returned his attention to the landlord. "Do you have any acknowledgement from her that she received it?" The answer came quickly this time. "No." The paper, once presented as proof, now sat useless on the bench. What had looked official moments earlier was unraveling under scrutiny. The judge placed it aside and asked the next question, his voice still calm, still measured. "Was there a court order authorizing the eviction?" The landlord hesitated. "Not yet," he said. "But she was behind on rent." The judge's expression didn't change. "So to be clear," he said, "there was no court order." The landlord nodded reluctantly. "No. That should have been the end of it." But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and asked a question that cut through everything else. "Did you personally change the locks on the apartment?" The landlord froze for a moment. The room seemed to hold its breath with him. He glanced toward his attorney, then back to the bench. "Yes," he said. "I did." There it was. No spin. No legal jargon. Just the truth spoken plainly. The words echoed far louder than any argument had. The mother lowered her eyes. The audience shifted. The weight of the admission settled heavily in the air. This wasn't about missed rent anymore. This wasn't about policy or procedure. This was about taking the law into your own hands. The judge didn't react immediately. He allowed the silence to do its work. Then he spoke, slowly and deliberately. "You changed the locks without a court order," he said. "Without verified notice. and without giving the tenant an opportunity to respond. He paused. "Do you understand what that means?" The landlord tried to answer, but the confidence that once carried him through the courtroom was gone. "I was protecting my property," he said weakly. The judge shook his head. "You were violating the law," he replied. The shift was complete. What had started as a dispute was now something else entirely. The evidence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. But it was devastating in its simplicity. A vague document. No proof of delivery. No court order. And a clear admission of an illegal lockout. The facts were no longer in question. And as the judge prepared to speak again, it became clear to everyone in that room that this case was about to move from explanation to consequence. She took a breath before speaking again, the kind of breath people take when they're about to revisit a moment they've been trying not to relive. Her voice lowered, slower now, as she explained what happened the night everything collapsed. She had just finished a long shift. It was late. The kids were tired and hungry, arguing softly in the back seat the way children do when routines fall apart. She pulled into the parking lot expecting nothing more than a quiet night, homework, and sleep. Instead, the first thing she noticed was the door. The handle looked different. No, shiny. She tried her key once. Then again. It wouldn't turn. At first, she thought she was exhausted and making a mistake. She checked the apartment number twice. Same door. Same hallway. Same place they had lived for months. But the key still wouldn't work. She felt that cold drop in her stomach before she even understood what it meant. The kids noticed too. They asked why they were still standing outside. She told them to wait, that she just needed a minute, her voice tighter than she intended. Then she saw their things. Bags. Boxes. A couple of trash bags stacked near the wall. Clothes stuffed inside hastily. School backpacks half-zipped. A blanket she recognized immediately because it was the one her daughters slept with every night. It was all there, placed outside like discarded items, not someone's life. She said she stood there staring for a few seconds, trying to understand how everything they owned could be reduced to a pile on a hallway floor. Her children started crying then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just confused tears. The kind that come when kids sense something is very wrong but don't have the words for it. She tried to stay calm. She told them it was going to be okay even though she had no idea how. She picked up bags with shaking hands, not knowing where she was supposed to take them. The neighbor's door stayed closed. No one intervened. No one explained. She told the court she felt exposed in a way she had never felt before. Not just homeless, but publicly stripped of stability. Every step she took that night felt watched, judged, permanent. She called the landlord. No answer. She left messages that were never returned. She called the police, hoping someone would at least tell her what was happening. They told her it was a civil matter. That they couldn't help. That she should go to court. Her voice wavered as she explained what she told her kids next. She didn't know where they were sleeping that night. She didn't know how she was supposed to get them to school the next morning without their uniforms, their books, their sense of normal. She said she kept apologizing to them, even though she didn't know what she was apologizing for. She hadn't done anything wrong. But guilt has a way of attaching itself to people who are already struggling. Then she said the line that changed the room. "My son asked me if the police were coming for us." She stopped speaking after that. She didn't need to say anything else. The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. A child, standing outside his own home, believing that what was happening must mean his family was in trouble. That they had done something bad. That punishment was coming. The courtroom went completely still. No shifting. No whispers. Just silence. You could feel the weight of it settle over everyone present. This wasn't about contracts anymore. It wasn't about deadlines or procedures. This was about fear being handed to children who had done nothing but trust the adults around them. Fear that didn't disappear when the door closed because there was no door to close. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed, as if crying were something she needed to apologize for too. She explained how she spent that night in a borrowed space, her kids asleep beside her on unfamiliar furniture, waking every few hours asking when they could go home. She said she kept checking her phone, hoping for a message, a mistake, an explanation. Nothing came. As she spoke, Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal that this was no longer a routine case. His hands rested on the bench, his attention fixed completely on her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He let her finish because moments like this don't need guiding, they need space. This was the point where the story stopped being theoretical. Where laws stopped being lines in a book and became something personal. Where everyone watching understood exactly what was at stake. A home isn't just a place. It's where children learn what safety feels like. And that safety had been ripped away without warning. Moments like this remind you why these stories matter, because one click of support helps make sure more people hear them. Not as entertainment but as reminders. Reminders that power unchecked leaves damage behind. And as the judge prepared to speak again, it was clear that the law was about to answer not just a landlord's actions, but the fear he left in his wake. Judge Frank Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence in the courtroom was already doing most of the work. He looked at the landlord for a long moment, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. "Let me explain something," he said evenly. "In this country, we do not allow people to take the law into their own hands." He spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure every word landed. Self-help evictions, he explained, are illegal in the United States. A landlord cannot decide on their own to remove a tenant from their home. Not by changing locks. Not by placing belongings outside. Not by intimidation or convenience. The law requires notice. The law requires process. And above all, the law requires a court order. When you skip those steps, he said, you're not enforcing a contract, you're violating the law. He pointed out the facts as they stood now, stripped of spin and excuses. There was no verified notice. No proof of delivery. No acknowledgement by the tenant. No court authorization. And there was a clear admission that the locks were changed anyway. That combination, he said, is not a gray area. It's a violation. The landlord shifted uncomfortably, his earlier certainty replaced by something quieter and far less convincing. Then the judge addressed the underlying belief that had driven the landlord's actions. Owning property does not give you power over people's dignity, he said. The line cut cleanly through the room. When you rent to a family, you take on responsibilities. You don't get to decide, on a bad day or a convenient one, that their home no longer counts. He turned his attention briefly to the mother, acknowledging the harm without dramatizing it. What happened to you and your children should not have happened, he said. The fear you described, that's real. And the law exists precisely to prevent that kind of harm. Then he returned his focus to the landlord because accountability, he made clear, was the purpose of this moment. This court is ordering immediate re-entry to the apartment, he said. Today. The word landed with finality. The family would be allowed back into their home without delay, without conditions, without negotiations. Any interference with that order, he added, will be treated seriously. But he wasn't finished. The judge explained that consequences had to reflect the damage done. The landlord would be responsible for covering temporary housing costs incurred as a result of the illegal lockout. Any damaged or lost property would be compensated. Court fines would be imposed, not as punishment for punishment's sake, but as a reminder that violations carry weight. This isn't about making an example, he said. It's about restoring what was taken and reinforcing the boundaries of the law. The landlord attempted to speak, but the judge raised a hand gently. You've had your opportunity, he said. Now you'll have your accountability. He made it clear that this was not optional, not negotiable, and not something that could be smoothed over later. Compliance was expected. Immediately. Then came the warning. Come. Direct. Unmistakable. Any future attempt to bypass the legal process, the judge said, will expose you to criminal contempt. The room understood what that meant. This was no longer a civil inconvenience. The line between business and criminal behavior had been drawn, and crossing it again would carry serious consequences. The judge leaned back, his point made. There was no flourish. No raised voice. Just the steady application of law where it mattered most. The kind of justice that doesn't seek applause because it doesn't need it. The landlord nodded stiffly, the posture of someone who had finally realized that confidence without legality is fragile. For the mother, the moment was quieter. Relief didn't come with celebration. It came with breath. With the knowledge that her children would sleep in their own beds again. That the fear they had carried would not be dismissed as collateral damage. The court had seen them, not as a footnote, not as an inconvenience, but as people. Justice in that room wasn't loud. It was firm. And as the judge concluded the matter, there was a sense, shared by everyone watching, that the law had done what it was meant to do. It had stood between power and vulnerability, and it had not moved. The family went home that same night. Not after weeks of waiting. Not after more paperwork. That evening, the door that had been closed to them was opened again, and the space that had been taken without warning was returned by law. The mother unlocked it slowly, almost cautiously, as if she were afraid it might disappear again. But it didn't. The apartment was quiet, familiar, imperfect in all the ways that make a place feel like home. And for the first time in days, her children slept in their own beds. The next morning they went back to school. Backpacks repacked. Shoes found. Lunches made. The routines that had been ripped away were stitched back together, one small step at a time. No announcements. No explanations needed. Just the quiet relief of normalcy returning. The kind that doesn't make headlines but makes all the difference. Their lives didn't become easier overnight, but they became stable again. And sometimes that's everything. The mother didn't celebrate the ruling. She didn't smile for the courtroom. She simply thanked the judge, gathered her papers, and left. The relief on her face wasn't dramatic. It was tired. The kind of relief that comes after holding yourself together for too long. She had done what she could. The law had done the rest. The landlord remained behind. The confidence that had carried him into the courtroom never returned. He sat still, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed somewhere between the floor and the bench. No arguments left. No corrections to make. The words that once came easily were gone. He nodded when instructed, gathered his things slowly, and walked out without looking back. Not defeated, but changed. The weight of consequence has a way of doing that. There were no cameras chasing anyone down the hallway. No public statements issued. No grand declarations of victory. That wasn't the point. The point was that a family was protected when they needed it most. That a line was drawn where it mattered. And that power for once didn't get to rewrite the rules. In that courtroom, the law reminded everyone who it's really meant to protect. Not those who can bend it. Not those who assume it favors them by default. But the people who rely on it when everything else has failed. The ones who don't have leverage, only hope that someone will listen. Stories like this don't always end in headlines, but they leave marks all the same. They remind us that justice isn't abstract. It lives in small apartments, in school mornings, in children who sleep without fear. It shows up when someone stands up and says, "This isn't right," and a system responds the way it's supposed to. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, stories where power doesn't win, you already know what to do. Because every time these moments are shared, they become harder to ignore. And the more they're seen, the less likely they are to happen again.